nobody thinks that, but it's fun in the aspect of some of the things we talked about, especially a lot of what we talked about last block. The why part of it and where it falls in gets in place. When we go through special senses, we see how those start to work. So there's actually a little more kind of a physiology side to special senses. There's still a big anatomy side, but we're going to look at more physiology than we normally do in most of the A&P I classes. So we start off with a long slide of stuff that I already built upon last block. Sensation versus perception. I started bringing that up, so when we got to here, you'd already know kind of the difference. And we can summarize the next two slides, but I'll go through them. But when you say a sensation, by definition, that's conscious or subconscious awareness of external and internal stimuli. That's the exact definition of it. And then when you look at, I'm going to flip, perception is the conscious awareness, and that's one of those things I would underline, interpretation. So if you remember just a few days ago, I would say you do not have perception of anything until it reaches the cerebral cortex. But you have sensations happening all the time. You can also think about it differently and say, well, we have sensations that our skin is somatic, like muscle and somatic. We have sensations of the skin. We also have sensation of the bowels. One is somatic, one is autonomic. But they're both a sensation, internal, external stimuli. That's all that means. And what we're switching is saying, well, we don't have perception unless it reaches the cerebral cortex. It's another way of saying that autonomic centers are not in the cerebral cortex. So they receive sensation, but you don't have perception. You don't know what your blood pressure is. Remember I said that before. Let me back in. So we start to define this more. When we look at impulses in the lower CNS, we have various reflexes that we discovered. And then we look at the thalamus. The thalamus is that main relay station for most sensory that's coming in. So anything that we want to look at now is the levels. Anything that reaches the thalamus, you're going to have what's called a crude sensation of it. We didn't say perception. We said crude sensation, meaning the body, you're going to be aware of it. It's a crude sensation. And when we look at impulse through cerebral cortex, now we can tell the precise location where it's at. This gets into things like discriminatory touch testing, that kind of stuff. So once again, no perception of sensory impulses that do not reach the thalamus or above. Right? If they go through the thalamus, it means you're going on up to the cortex. So blood pressure, carbon dioxide, you just will not be able to sense those. We have to look at now, what do we mean by a sensory? And we're going to use a new term for it, sensory modality. So when you say that you can feel touch or you can feel pain, any type of sensation, if you name a sensation, you would say that is the modality for that. So modality is a sensory, touch is a sensory modality. And we break those down into mostly what we've been talking about is general senses. Easier way to remember general versus special senses, that everything that's not in this block is a general sense. In other words, special senses, then everything else is general senses, because we only have a few special senses. We're going to spend the next week and a half on it, but we only have a couple that are considered special senses. So we only get one slide now on general senses. So somatic, meaning like out of the muscle, like a muscle spindle, would be a somatic sensory. Visceral senses, like mechanoreceptors in the bowels. And we could go through these and name them all, but we're going to go through them all as we go through this section. We'll look at the difference later between, well, what do you mean proprioception and dynamic sensations? Right? Proprioception encompasses a lot of different receptors throughout the body, including the head, but the dynamic sensations are particularly talking about your head and your limbs. We'll define that all later. So if we look at a general sense, it's a visceral sense. we don't normally appreciate that as feeling. So somebody who's having a heart attack will generally, before that, have a general sense. Like, it's almost like people will tell you, and my wife did this too. My wife had a heart attack at a young age, right? Did I tell you all that? Yeah, she was so in love. I changed that on you there. Changed it. She just dropped dead. No, she's doing great. She was going to the Y, teach an exercise class at like 38 years old. Her family has hypercholesterolemia so much that when she was pregnant and they take her blood, you could see the white. You ever seen that when somebody has bad cholesterol? You can see the tube's solid white at the top. They haven't even spun it down or anything yet. It's crazy. Anyway, she was going to teach this exercise class, and I didn't tell you all the story at all. You sure? And I thought I did. And anyway, I get this call as I'm driving down I-10. It says, hey, you need to come back to the Y. Your wife's like down. And an ambulance is coming. Anyway, by the time I got back there, I was like 5 miles away. I was headed here. And I got back there, and the ambulance there, she's in it, and they were about to close the doors. And the guy looks at me and says, I think she's having a heart attack. She's fine. We're headed to Bernie Methodist, and then we're going to San Antonio. We won't be at Methodist long, and he shut the doors. Follow us. I didn't know what he meant. Followed him Bernie Methodist, which is like 2 miles away. And we rushed in there, and they wheel her all in, and they hooked her to this EKG in 12 weeks. Say, yeah, she's having a heart attack. And this is where I knew why the ambulance never left the Army and was sitting out there running. Because they knew better than I did that Bernie Hospital is not set up for heart attacks. But they have to go there by regulation. I didn't think of any of that until this is the funny part. I was like, we'll do something, we're doing something. And then I heard him say, well, let's get the crash cart. And when I hear now I would be like a comedian. When I hear crash cart, I expect to hear big, heavy wheels. You know that sound of that crash cart rolling if you've ever been in a hospital? I didn't hear anything. And I look over, and I kid you not, they come in there with the Walmart tackle box and break the seal and open this thing up, and it's got some carton. And I'm like, oh, we got to get the hell out of here. We got to get out of here. And sure enough, before we even got past too many drug stuff, they're like, hey, we're going. Anyway, she got to the tech exam. That was at 8. By 11 o'clock, by the time I got, traffic used to be worse. By the time I got to the Tech Sam Heart Center, she was already sitting in her room eating lunch, and she had 3 vessels fully blocked, 1 90% blocked. They ballooned 1 and stented 3. She was eating lunch by 11 o'clock, and it's never showed up on EKG again. Like, that's awesome. See, I rounded that out. It's funny, but at the same time, it was very serious. But,
don't go to Bernie.
What's that?
Don't go to Bernie.
Don't go to Bernie. No. No. Not for something like that. I don't know why they have to take them there first. I guess they got to say, yes, it's money. Spend the money. They're having a heart attack. That's probably what it is. Right? Because if not, you're hauling them down to San Antonio. Special senses. Sorry, back to the class. These are our special senses. Smell, taste, vision, hearing, and equilibrium, which kind of always run together because that's our vestibulocochlear nerve and branches there. Before we get to all those, we're going to talk about how these are set up to work. So we're going to have to look at selectivity. So what's interesting is when you look at like an itch receptor, it only picks up itch. And it doesn't respond to other sensations at all. And if it does, it would be minimal. There's some overlap with studies they do on hot and cold receptors and how they can, we're not going to get into that. But think of it as each sensory receptor monitors only one type of stimulus. Like a touch receptor is looking for touch as its stimulus, right? A pain receptor is looking for something that causes pain. That's selectivity. Now somebody asked me this over the weekend, and I spelled it out for them, but I didn't spell it out for y'all last week because I wanted to leave it for now. You remember when we looked at reflex arcs? And specifically when we were looking at the autonomic reflex arc, and I said there's a sense in the order. I know y'all memorized them recently, so you would say, well, there's a sensory receptor and a sensory neuron. Right? A lot of sensory, like general senses, and some of the special, but most of the general senses, the free dendrites on the axon of that sensory neuron is actually the sensory receptors. So that portion of the sensory neuron has dendrites that are the sensory receptors. But there's a different way to do it too. Sometimes, and only in 3 of the special senses does this occur, you have a sensory neuron and then you have a cell that sits in front of it. So we have to start bringing in terms like first order neuron. The first neuron for a sensory going towards the CNS is called a first order neuron. When it synapses, it would go to the second order neuron, third order neuron. Same thing happens with motor when it comes back down. First order motor neurons leave the cerebral cortex and synapse with the second. Kind of makes sense if you've never heard those before. So a lot of times, or not a lot of times, 3 times in special senses, like a taste bud. A taste bud is a cell. And so that cell is the sensory receptor. And it has a first order sensory neuron behind it. And what somebody asked me over the weekend was about that. Wait, is there a cell there? Like, are these 2 different things? Is a sensory receptor different than a sensory neuron in a reflex side? Sometimes. I couldn't just reply sometimes because we had to talk about it here. So I'm going to show you what those are. If it doesn't make sense, that's fine at this point, but I'm going to show you. So we're going to go through each one of these on a separate slide. Events that are required to have sensation. And some of them are obvious. Like you can waste a slide easily in A&P I. You can say, okay, well, let's break these down. The stimulus must occur within the receptive field of the receptor. Why do we have to say something like that, though? Meaning, if there's no receptor in the area that stimulus occurs, you won't have the sensation. So we're quoting an obvious, but we don't think about things like the cerebral tissue, your neurons, your brain inside has no pain receptors. So when you say, my head's killing me, I have a headache, it has nothing to do with your neurons. It's other things in your head. There's no pain receptor, so there's no way that a stimulus could stimulate a receptor there. But in areas where we do, that stimulus has to be converted. So the body runs on electrical energy, just like we have electrons that move around in the body, we have ions. And we talked about action potentials and sending neurons and propagating. But that doesn't start out that way, because if I go to touch my skin, that's the stimulus. Is that an electrical stimulus? No, we're going to stimulate touch receptors that are there. So we have to do what's called transduction. And that means you're going to convert whatever type of stimulus it is into electrical energy. So when a sensory receptor transduces energy, this touching is a form of energy. Everything is a form of energy. But doing that action took energy during touch. But what we want to do is take that touch, we're going to decide whether or not we're going to send signals up that sensory neuron. So the sensory receptor transducts or transduces the energy of the stimulus into a graded potential. So we're going to talk about potentials. A graded potential can vary in amplitude. You could say that a different way and say, well, a touch could touch that area or a larger area, and you could have a different amplitude of the response, of the stimulus, response to the stimulus. And graded potentials are not propagated. So graded potentials are different than action potentials. Remember, once an action potential starts, it's going all the way down the axon to the end. And you can have more than one go down it, but we're just picturing one. So an action potential is all or none. A graded potential would be like neurons, 2 neurons talking to one. Remember summation? Those neurons that are talking to that neuron, hoping to cause a change, they're actually called graded potentials. Now, I just taught you how to sum them up in a basic way. But the neuron, the next neuron at the trigger zone, is really doing summation by, I always say, by grading the signals it's getting. So graded potentials are often short-lived. They don't travel all the way down an axon, but they serve to make quick changes. So if you're selective for one type of sensory, you're only going to transduce one type of sensory. So if you have a large, now we want to look at it and say, well, how do we get an action potential? If the stimulus produces a large enough graded potential that sums the threshold, negative 55, then you will trigger one or more nerve impulses to go down that axon. Y'all still with me on that? We got to reach threshold. Just picture the summation picture. And then if you get enough of those, enough stimulus to cause that next neuron to reach threshold, you will get one or more nerve impulses down. It's a lot more complicated than that, but I think that's a good way to visualize it. And that's why I say that the first order sensory neuron going towards the CNS is always called the first order. First order sensory neuron. Last part here is if we're going to take a sensory and send it to the CNS, there are specific parts of the CNS that will evaluate and integrate every different sense that comes in. That's what we learned with our brainstem and our nuclei, all of those. And so you have conscious sensations or perceptions would have to reach the cortex. In other words, once again, you got to reach the cortex before you become aware of it, conscious, aware of it, and that you can perceive that, meaning you can evaluate what it is, you can tell. That's the whole way that we do stimulus input. Should have put my water in here. I should have stopped by my office. I walked straight from the car in here. Mouth getting dry from all that salt in that food. Sensory receptor classification. We're jumping to it. We're just defining all these things before we keep explaining them more. I know you love that on Friday afternoon. So we're going to break them down and say, okay, what do these receptors look like? We can look at them as their microscopic appearance. We can look at the origin or where that receptor is at in the body, or we can define them by what type of stimulus. So a lot of these you've heard of. We're just going to mention them again, but the first microscopic appearance that we see, and it encompasses a lot of the senses, is bare dendrites. Meaning the sensory neuron has bare dendrites out there picking up itch, tickle, touch, pain. They're all using free nerve endings. And I do want you to pay attention to the differences in the receptors classifications, how they're built. Because you can use free nerve endings. If you want a free nerve ending, hope you are getting my vision. I don't have the axe on this whole thing. If you have a free nerve ending that's out there picking up like touch, pressure, or not pressure, sorry, touch, itch, tickle, it's out there. If you take and put a connective tissue capsule around it, like if I took a watermelon and put it around my hand, we would call it encapsulated. Encapsulated means their connective tissue capsule has surrounded the bare dendrites, and when it does that, it increases its sensitivity or specificity. Specificity meaning now it's very sensitive for that modality that it's trying to detect, and it's very specific. It's only looking for that, even more. Where we see this is pressure and vibration. Another word for encapsulated is lamellated. You put lamellant. You laminate it or you encapsulate it, those free nerve endings. Most of the time we look at this with what's called Meissner corpuscles, and they're corpuscles of touch. We also have Pacinian corpuscles, for those of you who've heard of them, and they help to explain pressure. Okay, so we'll look at the differences later between those two, but I just wanted to say it since it's up there. And then you have the separate cells. So a separate cell means they looked at the microscopic appearance of like the taste buds and its neural pathway, and they said, wait, the free nerve endings on a track it backwards actually. Let's go. We know sensory is coming from the taste buds to the CNS. Well, let's act like we were mapping it, and you go into the CNS, and you find that there's a nucleus in there for taste buds. There's a lot of negatives, right? 2/3, 1/3. You don't even want to hear that anymore. I know. It's there. And we started just back tracing that down, and we got to the end, and we said, okay, we should be reaching the free dendrites at this point. And then they go, whoa. Before that, there's something sitting there. That's a separate cell. So taste buds, photoreceptors in the eyes, and when you look at the, equilibrium, photoreceptors and gustatory, meaning taste, all three of those have a special cell called a receptor cell sitting in front of the first order neuron. I'm going to say that again, and let me know if you don't understand that. When you look at photoreceptors in the eye, and you look at gustation or equilibrium, the first order sensory neuron has a special cell, what's called a receptor cell, sitting in front of the first order neuron. So hopefully, if you can't visualize that, it'll lead you to problems later. You won't understand what this special cell is doing. And that this part's kind of the key here is the specialized cell synapses with the first order neuron. That makes sense? I see a lot of y'all nodding, so I'm thinking it's making sense. As much as we can on this grapefruit. Right. So we can never leave it simple enough. Because we brought up action potentials already again today, and then we brought in, yes?
Sorry. The peripheral nervous system, the sensory axon that's going back, we're talking about first order, second order. Does it ever take multiple, multiple nerves or axons or sensory neurons to get to the central nervous system? Or is it always a one-stop shop from actually receiving the sensory input to getting to the central nervous system?
Yeah, and it's a great question, actually. Meaning, can I rephrase it? You tell me.
Please. Yeah.
Sometimes when I rephrase it, I don't rephrase even your questions. You just laugh at me and tell me that's not what I meant. Do peripheral sensory nerves synapse before they get back to the spinal cord?
Pretty much.
All right? No. Remember back to pseudo-unipolar neurons? Picture those. So if you look at all sensory neurons for the peripheral, like itch, tickle, touch, their cell body is where? Dorsal root ganglion. And then they go into the, then its axon goes into the central nervous system at that point. But they don't synapse before that. But I say it's a great question because later, what y'all are going to learn, and I may mention it a few more times, we're not neuro. But now I know that I can define neurological problems, whether they're first order or second order, by knowing that. So if I've lost, well, I'm not going to get into it now, but you can decide whether something is probably going to be a first order neuron problem or second order neuron problem by looking at your symptoms. I'll show you that later, though. It may not be today, because today may not be the best day to kind of bring something like that. So what I was saying is you have graded potentials, action potentials. If you look at graded potentials, because, stay with me here, because there are free dendrites, and because some of the special senses have a special cell, free dendrites and that special cell are both called sensory receptors. You get that? That's equal. They're sensory receptors. So those sensory receptors produce two different types of signals. If it is a free dendrite, it's going to generate its own potential. It's going to cause a generated potential. I'm just trying to say it plain. Receptor, for those of you, especially if you've never seen this, probably for everybody, it's not something I would put on a slide, but I would if it was me studying it. If you do an up caret here and put cell, C-E-L, not S-A-L-E. Many of them look like cell. That's kind of good. Think of them as generator potentials and receptor cell potentials. The reason I want you to put that there is that reminds you that anytime you hear the word receptor potential, you know that there's a specialized cell sitting in front of that first order neuron. That's why. So I call it receptor cell potentials. Both of those are graded potentials, so we already said that graded potential is the amplitude variance. Yeah, depends on how strong the stimulus is. Question. So if we look at generator potentials and where we find those used, it's going to be all of our general senses. Free nerve endings, encapsulated nerve endings, the receptive part of the olfactory receptors. We'll leave that alone for now, but we'll get back to that. So in this case, if we're getting generator potentials and it's free nerve endings at all, so the sensory receptor is the first order neuron. And if you have a large enough generator potential, you will get to an action potential. So if we look at pictures of the difference, we can see here is a first order sensory neuron with free nerve endings. So this would be an example like we're picking up cold sensations. And here's your free dendrites. If you have a large enough stimulus, it will cause a generator potential that hopefully will stimulate an action potential down this axon back to the CNS. If you need it to be more selective or more specific for that, you'll take those free nerve endings of that first order sensory neuron that are here now, and we'll say, you know what, we found if we put a connected tissue capsule around it, it'll make it more selective. So you can call it encapsulated, you can call it lamellated, same thing. Still, if it picks up a strong enough generator potential, it will send. We're still using generator potential to send that to the central nervous system. Receptor potentials are different, though. So they're produced in the ear, really with equilibrium. Okay. Hair cells at the end of air. I was meant to say we look at it a lot in equilibrium, but the hair cells themselves that pick up your hearing are actually specialized cells too. Then you have taste buds, gustatory receptors, and you have photoreceptors. All right, so this is the I've never heard that thing ring like that. Must have changed on. Did y'all ring like that? On the actual watch? No, it just buzzes. Makes you look bad when you're on the podium. Your phone starts ringing. Y'all don't expect that much out of me by now anyway. So all right. So if you look at receptor potentials, right cell up there again, receptor cell potentials, means we got this special cell sitting out there. What are they called? They're called hair cells. They're called taste buds. They're called photoreceptors. But they're just a cell that's specialized to do a function. So in that case, we're going to black box a little bit of this. Is if you look at receptor cell potentials, that's actually going to be what triggers the release of neurotransmitter across the synaptic cleft. Now don't start going back to last block. Right? We finished last block today. I know you hear that and you're like, oh, we're going to start talking about this stuff again? Synaptics? No, we're going to, now that we pass it, we're going to make some assumptions. Right? So when you look at a receptor cell, something's going to stimulate that cell, like in the eyes, photoreceptors have a photon of light that strikes them. When that photon of light hits that photoreceptor, events that we'll talk about later, it causes a reaction inside of that cell, which triggers release of neurotransmitter. Because that's a receptor cell sitting in front of a first-order neuron. The first-order neuron still has dendrites that are there, and so there's going to be a release of a neurotransmitter to cross that distance and stimulate the first-order neuron. In that case, we call it a receptor cell potential because the potential had to occur in the cell. The part I was saying we're not going to bring up is I'm not even going to mention what neurotransmitter it is. It just is. It's a neurotransmitter. If you don't like that, call it acetylcholine if you like. Because you're probably right, but maybe not in some of the brain cases. Right. So that's a receptor cell potential. In this case, that means, unlike generator potentials, your receptor cell is not the first order neuron. I keep saying it. It's like the fourth time I say that because people get confused about that. Because here is a taste bud, we look at a taste bud, it's sitting in front of the first order neuron. And so you have a stimulus, like a sugar molecule that comes along here, stimulates that cell and it releases neurotransmitter to stimulate the first order neuron, hopefully send the signal all the way down that axon. I'm glad you asked the question because I was being rude, making sure nobody's like on the side of the road or something. Go ahead.
In this, what is the first order neuron? Is it
This.
that whole thing is the first order?
There's its axon, there's its dendrites. That's a cell sitting in front of it.
So an example would be like the dorsal root ganglia would be first order?
Well, no. Well, for sensory neurons coming in the peripheral, their cell body's in the dorsal root ganglion, so it's a first order neuron. Yes. But in special senses, you take that same setup and put a cell in front of it. But first orders that are found in the dorsal root ganglion aren't. They're all general senses. It's a good. I see what you're getting to. Is that confusing?
No.
Somebody have something?
No, I was just going to ask if that's cell line.
It's not because it's a special sense. We're already up in the brainstem region. Right, we only have dorsal root ganglion down at the spinal cord. These aren't using the spinal cord. No. They're going directly in. Now, most of these go directly. I'll give you an example. Like a taste bud, we're going to look at the pathway. It's mainly going to go to the thalamus and then to higher sensory. It's not going to the spinal cord, so you don't need a dorsal root ganglion. As y'all are talking about it, I'm trying to figure out how y'all got there, because nobody's ever asked me that. If a taste bud's first order neuron is in the dorsal root ganglion.
So would it be, I guess, in the medulla? Because it's
No. Well, yes.
Now we're getting
Y'all hang on. Because what you want to know is going to be at the end of the block. When we talk about smell and taste, the last part that nobody ever really does want to see is I show you the pathway from like the inner ear to the medulla, the pons. I'm going to show you those nuclei as we go. Yeah, we don't get it now. He said we want it now. But the answer is just for now, about if that's fair enough. These don't go to a dorsal root ganglion. They go, just picture them going, if you want to throw the medulla in there, we'll do that. It goes to the medulla, then goes to the thalamus. See, if I get too far ahead, then you'll come back and go, we'll get to olfaction, you're going to go, what do you mean olfaction doesn't go to the thalamus? It doesn't. It goes straight to the cortex. See why I don't want to get into it? We'll get there. But I had to say something to prove I knew your answer. I'm not just tap dancing. Y'all are pretty energized to this. Hey, we're still talking about how we classify these receptors. So we looking at kind of how they're set up. Now we're going to look at where they're at and what activates them. And these should be pretty familiar because you're hearing this in multiple classes. Exteroreceptors would be near the body, outside of the body. So sight, odor. We look at taste, touch, pressure. If you notice with the exteroreceptors, it's just a grouping in classification. So anything that is receiving some type of sensory from the outside of the body falls under. So we see a mixture of special and general senses in our examples. Interoreceptors, though, are dealing with the viscera, your blood vessels, your abdominal organs, all of that. And it's telling you inside what's going on. It's telling the brain what's going on in like the bowels. And then proprioceptors are everywhere. Proprioception means one's own, or if you think of just standing there with your eyes closed, proprioception tells you wholly where your body is at in space. But there's not one single type of receptor for proprioception. There are many. There are a lot of different ways the body does proprioception. Because it's looking at body position, muscle length, motion of joints. We actually have areas that they call joint kinesthetic receptors where we can tell how fast the joint's moving, how much pressure's on it. So proprioception is a little more complicated and also includes equilibrium. You don't know where you are in space, you also don't want to fall down. Yeah.
Would a kidney stone be an external receptor? I see the pain, I don't want to it says external environment. So when I think kidney stone is internal, would it be another type of receptor?
I would still consider that an exteroreceptor for the pain. I mean, it's a great, it's not even hypothetical, that's real world, but at the same time, that's a pain. It's not going to be a visceral type of pain because you're going to feel that right away. And the part that I could add into that is probably because the kidney stone itself may not hurt your ureter, but if you're studying renal now, right? What's around your ureters? There's a muscular layer around it that's going to contract too, and it's going to try and force that thing through there, and that's what hurts. So I would consider it an external. Y'all are on it today. That's a good question. Made me have to think through kidney stone. You ever had a kidney stone? Just throwing that out there.
Not related.
Thinking about how fun they are. Yeah, people love them. They'll let you know when they come to see you. Kidney stone is a reason to give pain meds to people. You know, we're cutting down on pain meds. They've decreased most people's pain. You go to a doctor nowadays, you have your foot cut off, and they're like, all right, here's some. Actually, I was about to say they throw you some ibuprofen. They don't even do that nowadays. They go, well, you can get that at Walmart. You ever tell you that? Army doctor tells me I can get Motrin or something at Walmart. I go, yeah, just write the script. I'm getting it from the pharmacy. They're always, why do you get it here when you can buy it? And you said the word buy, I'm cheap. Cheap. I did 21 years so I could be cheap about my pharmacy. You know, I got sidetracked on my own that time. I gripe about pharmacy every day because I'm not going to pay. And we use Express Scripts and you'll never have a problem with going to the pharmacy. I mean, if you're not active duty, Express Scripts, now this is what do they call a first world complaint. For me, as a retiree, it will cost you $6 per script. It's not free for Express Scripts. When I was on active duty for a while, I never realized that. I tell everybody, get an Express Scripts. They know that to you. Because for active duty, it's free. Then they got the other people that don't have military insurance going, you mean they'll mail it to you for 90 days for $6? I would do that all the time. And I'm like, I just say, no, I got better insurance than you. Like, I'm not paying. I'll drive to the pharmacy. Sorry, now y'all got me on the stuff. See, y'all wanted me to have something to think about. Did I say something wrong on the way home? I got you. Hey, what if we want to change the way we classify them and say, what about the type of stimulus detected? That's where all these names that I know you've heard of these, mechanoreceptors, I don't need to go through the whole thing, mechanoreceptors, thermoreceptors for heat, nociceptors. Maybe you haven't heard that one before, but nocioception is pain reception. So it would be a nocioceptor receptor. And then photoreceptors, chemoreceptors, osmo. We should be, I'm betting, pretty familiar with those names by now in PA school. So those are our classification types. What's interesting about all sensory is it adapts. Some sensory adapts very, very quickly. Some adapts very slowly. Like proprioception is a very, very slow. The whole system is considered a slowly adapting system. But smell is rapidly adapting. So adaptation, we have to describe what that is. And my best example, this picture is not from there, but it makes me picture, I went to Pagosa Springs, Colorado. Anybody ever been there? They got the hot water things. They have sulfur baths, and And they have them, and I don't know the temperatures, but let's just say one's at 100, and then the hottest one's 107. It's a big difference to the body. I don't know. You know how hot they are? Yeah. But you can't just go get in the hot one. It's not going to scald you, but you're not going to be comfortable for a while. But you go from one to the, y'all know what I'm talking. You go from one to the next, so you adapt. And the crazy part of it is, when I was there, your head's frozen though, because it's snowing. You're getting in these hot. I don't need to do that again. It's not my cup of tea. I'll do it. I'll do it in the summer. No. Did you? I don't even get in the shower till it's warm.
So you said the smelling is more adaptable. Is that why, like you're in a room full of filth, and some people don't realize, like, you leave a room and you come back, and oh my god, there's so much shit in here, I didn't realize.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. And that not only that's not even taking into the fact that you get used to the smells around you. Like some people can't smell what their house smells like, even though they walk outside. They're used to that smell being in their house, and their brain knows that. But when you talk about smell adaptation, it's talking about, like, if you walk out and go into the bathroom over there, probably about right now, you'll walk and you hit that door, and whoa, you know. And as you go in, smell, the first 50% of what you just smell adapts within the first few seconds. It's very rapid, or you wouldn't keep walking in there. And then after about a minute, that smell is, you don't recognize it anymore. The smell didn't go away, it's just adapted to where it. But if it's a slow adapting receptor, it will continue to send that stimulus for a long period of time. You'll perceive it like pain. Pain serves a protective function. More when we get the smell on that, and that bathroom.
I was just going to ask, is that like you make the decision that it's not a problem, and that's what you adapt to? Like, once you're sort of deciding what it is, or like, cause like if you continue to smell something, you know what it is, or you continue to like set off your senses more.
No, it's a great question. You will still adapt, but kind of, I think where you're going to wind up getting to that with that thought process is, why does smell adapt so quickly? If it's there to protect us from things, it's there to signal any rapidly adapting receptor in the body, evolutionary-wise, is meant to protect you. And so if you notice, now I get an analogy of, like, you pick up the milk and you smell it bad. If you stood there and held it under your nose, within a minute, it smelled just fine until you took it away. Or even with taste. Taste is slower than smell. Like taste, you eat a piece of apple pie, like at a contest, and you got a bunch of them in front of you, you got to wait. And actually, you should wait like 5 minutes in between. It's like eating chocolate cake for taste. You take that chocolate cake, it tastes so good, but a few bites into it, it's not making you roll your eyes anymore. Well, go take a walk for 10 minutes, come back, and make you roll your eyes again. If you're like me, I don't like to come back to the table twice. I'm just going to finish it. And I see a common trend here of y'all slowing me down on my slides today. I'm completely kidding. That was a great question. We need to take a break. Actually, I'm done for the day. Y'all, is that good with y'all? Yeah. I know you got I just decided that. I know you got another class, and I probably should keep going, but it is Friday for y'all. Relax before your next class. Sorry I got to be here so late today.